You clean floors, not engines. Don't touch that panel. The CEO's voice sliced through the hangar louder than the turbine wind. His polished shoes stopped inches from the girl kneeling beside the jet's open access hatch. Executives nearby chuckled, someone muttering that $80 million aircraft weren't toys for janitors with a mop. She didn't answer. Didn't argue. Just looked at the silent jet for one long second. 12 minutes later, the same aircraft would roar down that runway while the man who mocked her stood frozen on the tarmac. Because the girl everyone ignored understood the machine better than anyone in that hangar. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Because what looked like a janitor being scolded beside a luxury jet wasn't really about cleaning floors at all. It was about a truth powerful people forget too easily. Sometimes, the quietest worker in the room is the only one who knows how to save everything. And before you see the moment when a dead cockpit suddenly flickers back to life while engineers stare in disbelief, you need to understand how a cleaning girl ended up standing beside the most advanced private jet in the country. She was small, barely 18, dressed in a faded gray uniform that hung loose on narrow shoulders. The name stitched on the pocket read Mira Solon. Most people at Halverson Private Aviation Terminal never noticed the name. They noticed the mop, the bucket, the quiet way she moved along polished hangar floors while billionaires arrived in tinted SUVs. But the girl noticed everything. The sound of turbines spooling down, the faint smell of heated wiring inside an open service hatch, the rhythm of engineers arguing about diagnostics while pretending not to look at her. And most of all, the jet. Victor Halverson's jet. It stood at the center of the hangar like a polished monument to wealth, its silver body reflecting the long rows of fluorescent lights above. To everyone else, it was a symbol of power. To the girl holding the mop, it was something else entirely. A machine, a system, something that could break. Her gloved fingers had hovered near the exposed avionics panel for less than 3 seconds, just long enough to recognize the layout, just long enough for the CEO to see her. "Hey," Halverson snapped again, irritation thick in his voice. "Did you hear what I said?" She stood slowly, calm, unshakable. "I heard you," the girl said quietly. The executives expected an apology, maybe embarrassment. Instead, she simply stepped back from the aircraft and picked up her mop again, as if his anger had nothing to do with her. That calm unsettled him. Powerful men like Victor Halverson were used to reactions: fear, nervous laughter, quick apologies. But the janitor gave him none of those. She just moved aside and watched. Outside the hangar doors, the evening sky glowed a deep orange as the sun dipped behind distant runways. The air carried the distant howl of departing aircraft and the sharp scent of aviation fuel. A convoy of black SUVs rolled toward the jet. Security opened doors. Assistants rushed forward. Halverson's flight was already late, and tonight's passengers weren't ordinary clients. A pediatric surgeon stepped out of the second vehicle, clutching a small medical bag. Beside her, a boy no older than 8 held her hand, his face pale beneath the airport lights. The doctor's voice carried urgency as she spoke to the ground crew. "Is the aircraft ready?" she asked. "We need to be airborne immediately." One of the engineers nodded. Final systems check, then departure. The child looked toward the jet with wide eyes. To him, the aircraft wasn't a machine. It was hope. The girl watched them quietly from the edge of the hangar, mop resting against her shoulder. A child. A doctor. An emergency flight. Something inside her chest tightened. Because once, not long ago, she had studied machines exactly like this one, back when life looked very different, back when she had a family, back when her world wasn't measured by janitor shifts and rented rooms above a laundromat. A mechanic closed the avionics panel she'd been examining earlier and secured the hatch. System check complete, he called toward the cockpit ladder. Halverson clapped once impatiently. Good, let's move. Executives began boarding. The doctor guided the boy up the stairs carefully. Inside the cockpit, engineers powered up the aircraft's systems. Lights flickered across the instrument panels. Then, silence. The cockpit screens went dark. A sharp alarm chirped once, then stopped. One of the engineers frowned. That's odd. He flipped a switch. Nothing. Another technician leaned into the panel. What just happened? Outside, Halverson crossed his arms. Well? He barked. The engineer's voice drifted down from the cockpit. Avionics just shut down. The hangar fell quiet. Halverson's expression hardened. You're telling me my jet doesn't work? The engineers scrambled, pulling diagnostic tablets and opening panels again. Inside the cabin, the doctor's anxious voice rose. How long will this take? No one answered. The boy sat silently beside the window, small fingers gripping the armrest. Across the hangar floor, the girl with the mop watched the cockpit screens through the open door. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Because the pattern of failure looked familiar, very familiar. And somewhere deep inside her memory, a lecture hall, a professor's voice, and a simulation warning echoed back to life. She set the mop down. Slowly, then took a step toward the jet. The girl took another quiet step toward the jet. Inside the cockpit, engineers were already speaking faster now, the calm confidence from earlier dissolving into sharp confusion. Tablets flickered with diagnostic readouts, and one technician tapped the side of the avionics panel as if the machine might respond to irritation. That's impossible, Jonas Pritchard muttered, squinting at the display. The system just rebooted itself into a dead loop. Victor Halverson's voice rose from the hangar floor. To find dead loop, Jonas leaned out of the cockpit door. The flight computers won't complete startup. Something in the avionics network is blocking initialization. Halverson exhaled sharply through his nose. Fix it. We're trying. The girl stopped beside the service ladder, eyes lifted toward the dark cockpit screens. The smell of warm wiring drifted faintly through the open hatch. Beneath it, something else, barely noticeable unless you knew machines well. A faint electrical rhythm. Not failure. Conflict. Jonas turned to another engineer. Pull the secondary diagnostics. The younger technician connected a tablet into the auxiliary port. The screen flashed error after error. Sensor conflict, flight computer restart, system lock. Why would the sensors fight each other? The technician asked. Jonas rubbed his temple. They shouldn't. The girl shifted her weight quietly, watching the lines of code scrolling across the tablet. Her voice came soft. Because they're listening to the same signal twice, the two engineers froze. Jonas looked down from the cockpit ladder. For a moment he didn't recognize who had spoken. Then he saw the gray cleaning uniform. You again, he said. Halverson turned, irritation already rising in his expression. Didn't I tell you to stay away from the aircraft? The girl didn't flinch. Her eyes remained on the cockpit instruments. The left sensor array, she said calmly. It's feeding duplicate data into the avionics bus. Jonas blinked. That's not possible. She pointed toward the underside access panel. The harness under the diagnostic port. The younger engineer frowned. That's just a sensor relay, not when it loops back through the auxiliary channel. Silence settled across the hangar. Halverson laughed once. A short, disbelieving sound. You're diagnosing my jet now? He said. With a mop in your hand? The executive standing behind him chuckled politely. The girl lowered her gaze. Not embarrassed, just patient. Jonas hesitated. because the explanation, impossible as it sounded, matched the error pattern on his tablet almost exactly. He shook his head anyway. "Look," he said, climbing down the ladder, "I appreciate enthusiasm, but this is a very advanced aircraft." The girl nodded once. "I know." Halverson spread his arms dramatically toward the jet. "Exactly. Which is why we pay actual engineers to deal with it." The doctor's voice drifted from inside the cabin. "Excuse me," she called anxiously, appearing at the aircraft door. "How long will this take?" Jonas hesitated. "We're still diagnosing the issue." Her eyes flicked toward the boy sitting behind her. He looked smaller now, pale beneath the cabin lights. "We don't have hours," she said quietly. Halverson stepped forward quickly, smoothing his jacket as if the delay were merely an inconvenience. "Doctor, relax. My team handles problems like this every day." Behind him, the engineers exchanged uneasy glances. Because they didn't, not this kind. The tablet chimed again, another failed reboot. Jonas stared at the screen, system still locked. The girl spoke again. "If you disconnect the sensor harness for 3 seconds, the flight computer will restart clean." Halverson spun around. "Enough." His voice echoed through the hangar. "You've already crossed the line once touching my aircraft." He stepped closer, towering over her. "I'm not about to take technical advice from someone who scrubs hangar floors." The girl met his gaze calmly. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. Just said quietly, "It will work." Halverson laughed again. "Of course it will." He turned back toward the engineers. "Are we seriously still standing here listening to this?" Jonas hesitated, because the error codes on his tablet were now repeating in a pattern. Exactly the pattern she had described: duplicate sensor input, auxiliary loop conflict. He frowned slightly. The younger engineer noticed. "You don't think she's—" "No," Jonas said quickly. But the doubt had already entered the room. Across the hangar, the boy inside the jet shifted weakly in his seat. The doctor watched the delay with tightening worry. The girl glanced toward the aircraft door. Her expression softened for a moment. Then she looked back at the cockpit screens, the flicker of dead avionics, the looping errors. The exact failure mode she had once studied in a simulation lab thousands of miles away. A professor's voice echoed faintly in memory, rare but catastrophic if ignored. Jonas sighed heavily. "Run the diagnostics again," he told the technician. The tablet beeped. Same result. Halverson's patience snapped. "I'm done waiting," he said sharply. "Call another engineering team. They're 40 minutes away," Jonas replied. Halverson swore under his breath. Inside the cabin, the doctor leaned against the doorway. "We don't have 40 minutes. No one spoke." The silence stretched across the hangar like tension before a storm. Then the girl stepped closer to the ladder. "If you want the jet flying tonight," she said quietly, "you'll need to reset the sensor loop." Halverson's jaw tightened. Jonas stared at her. And somewhere deep inside his professional pride, a small, uncomfortable thought formed. What if she wasn't guessing? Jonas Pritchard didn't answer the question forming in his own mind. Instead, he stared down at the tablet again, as if the screen might prove the girl wrong by sheer stubbornness. The diagnostic loop continued flashing the same warning every few seconds. Sensor conflict. Flight computer restart. System lock. The repetition was starting to feel personal. Behind him, Victor Halverson's patience was thinning like ice under heavy boots. "Well?" the CEO demanded. "Is someone fixing my aircraft, or are we planning to stare at screens all night?" Jonas climbed halfway down the ladder, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're isolating the fault." Halverson gestured sharply toward the cockpit. "You've been isolating it for 10 minutes. 8. Jonas corrected automatically. "That's 8 minutes too long. Inside the aircraft cabin, the pediatric doctor stood beside the small boy now slumped against the seatbelt strap. The harsh white lighting of the jet made the child look even paler. Her voice came down the stairwell, tight with fear. "Please tell me you're close." Jonas glanced toward her and hesitated. Close wasn't the word. The avionics system was locked inside its own software loop. Every reboot triggered the same sensor disagreement, forcing the computers to shut down again. A rare failure. One he had never personally seen in real life. Behind the ladder, the quiet cleaning girl remained exactly where she had been, watching. Her eyes moved across the open avionics hatch, the wires, the diagnostic tablet, the cockpit screens. The pattern was unmistakable now. The exact cascade she had studied once during advanced avionics training. Years ago, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She folded her arms slowly. The hangar smelled like heated metal and impatience. Jonas crouched again beside the open access panel. "Try isolating the primary sensor array," he told the younger technician. The man nodded and began unplugging connectors. The tablet chirped. Another reboot attempt. Another failure. The screen flashed red, system lock. Jonas sighed heavily. Halverson's shoes clicked sharply across the hangar floor as he approached the aircraft. "Explain something to me," the CEO said. Jonas looked up. "Why is my jet the only thing in this hangar that apparently doesn't work?" The engineer chose his words carefully. Modern aircraft are extremely complex systems. Halverson stared at him. That wasn't an explanation. Jonas gestured toward the avionics compartment. "We're dealing with a software loop inside the flight computer network, and until we isolate which sensor triggered it, the aircraft won't complete startup." Halverson crossed his arms. "So isolate it, we're trying." Behind them, the girl spoke quietly again. "You won't find it there." Every head turned. Jonas stared down at her from the ladder. "What?" She stepped closer to the open hatch, pointing toward the underside of the avionics rack. "The auxiliary harness is feeding duplicate signals back into the system." Jonas frowned. "That harness only carries backup telemetry. It loops through the diagnostic port," she said. The younger technician glanced at his tablet again. "Actually," he said slowly. Jonas looked over. The engineer pointed at the diagnostic log. 2 of the sensors are reporting identical timestamps. Jonas blinked. "That's impossible." The girl tilted her head slightly. "Not if the loop runs through the auxiliary channel." Halverson laughed again, louder this time. "Oh, this is unbelievable." He looked around the hangar. "My engineering team is now taking advice from the janitorial department." The executives behind him shifted awkwardly. But Jonas wasn't laughing. He leaned down toward the harness she had pointed at. The cable ran beneath the avionics tray, partially hidden behind a bundle of connectors. He pulled the line gently. The diagnostic tablet beeped. The younger engineer stared at the screen. "Wait." Jonas froze. "What?" The man turned the tablet so Jonas could see. The error pattern had changed, not fixed, but different. The duplicate sensor conflict disappeared for half a second before the system locked again. Jonas slowly looked down at the girl. "You've seen this before." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied the wiring again, eyes narrowing. "Yes," she said softly. Halverson threw his hands into the air. "Of course she has." He stepped forward, voice dripping sarcasm. "What's next? The mop bucket contains spare jet engines?" The girl ignored him. Her focus stayed on the avionics rack. "Disconnect the harness," she said. Jonas hesitated. "For how long?" 3 seconds. The younger engineer frowned. "That would reset the sensor bus." Jonas looked between them. "You're suggesting a manual reset?" She nodded once. The hangar fell quiet again. Because manual overrides weren't common. They were used when every automated system failed. Halverson shook his head slowly. You're not seriously considering this? Jonas didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the child sitting inside the aircraft cabin. The boy's head rested weakly against the seat. The doctor knelt beside him, whispering reassurance. Then Jonas looked back at the silent avionics panel. The looping errors, the harness, and the quiet girl who seemed far too confident for someone holding a janitor's mop 10 minutes earlier. "What happens if we try it?" he asked her. She met his eyes. "The computers reboot clean, and if you're wrong..." She shrugged lightly. "Then you're still exactly where you are now." Halverson scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Jonas slowly reached for the harness. Because somewhere deep inside his engineer's instinct, the impossible explanation was starting to make sense. And the only person in the hangar who seemed absolutely certain was the girl they had just mocked. Jonas Pritchard held the cable in his hand, the thin bundle of insulated wires suddenly feeling heavier than it should. 3 seconds, that was all the girl had said. 3 seconds without the auxiliary harness feeding data into the avionics bus. In theory, it would force the flight computers to rebuild their sensor network from scratch. In reality, it could trigger a deeper system crash. The younger engineer watched him carefully. "You thinking about it?" Jonas didn't answer immediately. He looked down toward the hangar floor where the cleaning girl stood quietly beside the ladder. Her gray uniform blended into the industrial shadows, but her posture remained steady, almost patient. Victor Halverson's voice cut through the silence again. "You're not actually listening to her." Jonas exhaled slowly. "I'm considering an option." Halverson threw up his hands. "Your option is the janitor?" Behind him, several executives shifted uncomfortably, pretending to study their phones while tension thickened in the air. Jonas turned back to the avionics rack. "Her explanation matches the error pattern." Halverson laughed sharply. She pointed at a wire. She described the loop structure correctly. "And you're impressed by that?" Jonas's patience finally thinned. "This isn't about being impressed." The CEO leaned closer. "Then what is it about?" Jonas gestured toward the cockpit screens, still dead and silent. "It's about the fact that nothing else we've tried has worked." That answer hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Because it was true. Halverson looked past him toward the aircraft cabin where the doctor waited beside the small boy. The child's breathing had grown shallow, uneven. The doctor met the CEO's eyes from the doorway. "We can't keep waiting." Her voice wasn't angry, just desperate. Halverson turned back to Jonas, jaw tightening. "Fix the jet, that's what I'm trying to do, then do it." Jonas glanced again at the cable in his hand. 3 seconds. He looked down the ladder. The girl hadn't moved. "You're certain?" he asked her quietly. Her gaze lifted toward the avionics rack. "The sensor loop resets if the harness disconnects." "You sound very confident. I've seen the failure before." Halverson snorted. "Of course she has." He paced across the hangar floor, voice rising again. "This is exactly the problem with places like this. Everyone suddenly becomes an expert when something breaks." The girl said nothing. Her calm seemed to irritate him more than defiance would have. Jonas watched her for another moment. No arrogance, no hesitation, just quiet certainty. He turned back toward the avionics rack. "All right," he muttered. The younger engineer blinked. "You're serious?" Jonas nodded once. "We've already isolated every other sensor, and if this fries the system?" Jonas shrugged lightly. "Then we'll still have a broken aircraft." Halverson stepped closer again. "I don't recall approving experimental repairs suggested by the cleaning staff." Jonas looked down at him from the ladder. "With respect, sir, the aircraft already isn't flying." Halverson's mouth tightened. Inside the cabin, the doctor whispered something to the boy, brushing his hair gently from his forehead. The child looked out the window toward the hangar lights, eyes dull with exhaustion. The sight settled the argument. Jonas wrapped his fingers around the harness connector. "Ready on the diagnostic tablet?" he asked the younger engineer. The man nodded nervously. Monitoring system status. Jonas inhaled once, then looked down at the girl again. 3 seconds, she nodded. 1, 2. He pulled the connector free. The avionics panel went completely dark. Every light inside the cockpit vanished at once. The younger engineer stared at the tablet. System offline. Jonas counted silently in his head. 1, 2, 3. He pushed the harness back into place. The cockpit remained silent. For one long moment, nothing happened. Halverson folded his arms. "Well?" The younger engineer's tablet chimed. Once, then again. Jonas leaned over his shoulder. The diagnostic log began scrolling rapidly. Flight computer initializing. Sensor array syncing. Data stream rebuilding. The younger engineer's eyes widened. Wait. Jonas leaned closer. The error message disappeared from the screen. For the first time since the failure began, the system log showed no sensor conflict. "Reboot sequence started," the engineer whispered. Across the cockpit, one of the instrument panels flickered faintly. Halverson frowned. What was that? Jonas didn't answer. Because the overhead display blinked once, then powered on fully. Green indicators lit across the dashboard. The aircraft's systems began waking up one by one. Inside the cabin, the doctor looked up as the lighting shifted slightly. The boy blinked weakly. The cockpit screens continued lighting in sequence. Navigation, flight controls, engine systems. Jonas stared at the displays in disbelief. The avionics network had restarted clean. No errors, no lock, no loop, just a perfectly functioning system. The younger engineer whispered, stunned. That worked. Halverson stepped toward the ladder slowly. What did you do? Jonas looked down at the girl standing quietly beside the aircraft. Her expression hadn't changed. No triumph, no smug satisfaction, just the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. He exhaled softly. She told us where the problem was. Halverson stared at her. For the first time that evening, the CEO looked uncertain, and somewhere deep inside his mind, a new question began forming. Who exactly was the janitor standing beside his jet? Victor Halverson stared at the cockpit displays as if they had betrayed him. A moment ago, the aircraft had been dead. An $80 million machine frozen by a failure none of his highly paid engineers could solve. Now every screen glowed alive. Navigation maps flickered into place. Engine diagnostics streamed across the panels. Flight computers hummed back into synchronization as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Jonas Pritchard ran his fingers across the console, confirming what the screens already showed. No sensor conflict, he murmured. The younger engineer leaned closer to the tablet. System log is clean. Jonas shook his head slowly. Clean restart. Behind them, Halverson's voice rose. That's impossible. Jonas turned slightly. It's not impossible. It's working. The CEO climbed halfway up the ladder, peering inside the cockpit. Explain how. Jonas gestured toward the avionics rack. We reset the sensor loop. Halverson frowned. We? Jonas glanced toward the hangar floor. The girl still stood beside the aircraft where she had been minutes earlier, hands resting lightly against the mop handle. Quiet, unassuming. Halverson followed his gaze. You're joking. Jonas didn't smile. She diagnosed the loop. The CEO blinked once, processing the sentence. Then he laughed. A short, incredulous sound. The cleaning girl fixed my jet? Jonas spoke carefully. She told us where the failure was. Halverson climbed down the ladder slowly, eyes narrowing as he approached her. Around them, engineers were still studying the rebooting systems, half stunned by what had just happened. The CEO stopped a few feet away from the girl. "Well," he said dryly, "this is fascinating." She met his gaze calmly. "You're welcome." The simple words seemed to irritate him even more. "Don't get ahead of yourself," he replied. Jonas spoke from above them. "Engines are ready for startup." Halverson turned back toward the aircraft. "Then start them." Inside the cockpit, the engineer flipped the ignition sequence. A deep mechanical whine rolled through the hangar as the jet's turbines began spinning to life. The sound built steadily, vibrating through the polished concrete floor. Outside the cabin window, the boy looked up weakly as the aircraft stirred. The doctor exhaled in relief. Jonas checked the final diagnostics. All systems operational. Halverson nodded sharply. "Good." The CEO looked back toward the girl again. His expression had changed slightly now, the arrogance hadn't vanished. But something else had appeared beneath it. Suspicion. "You said you'd seen that failure before," he said. She nodded once. "Yes. Where?" Her answer came without hesitation. "In training." Jonas froze halfway down the ladder. "Training?" Halverson crossed his arms. "Training for what exactly?" The girl's eyes flicked briefly toward the avionics panel. Advanced avionics systems. The engineers exchanged glances. Jonas climbed the last few steps down the ladder, curiosity now overtaking his earlier doubt. "That's not something you pick up casually." "No," she agreed. Halverson tilted his head. "So let me understand this," he said slowly. "You studied avionics, yes. Advanced avionics, yes. And now you clean hangar floors." She shrugged slightly. "Life changes." The CEO stared at her. For the first time that evening, he didn't have a quick reply. Jonas spoke carefully. "Where did you train?" She hesitated. Just for a moment. Then answered. "Helix Aerospace Institute." The name landed in the hangar like a dropped wrench. The younger engineer's eyes widened. "Helix?" Jonas blinked. "That's one of the most competitive engineering programs in the world." Halverson frowned. "You expect me to believe that?" The girl didn't respond. She simply picked up the mop again. Across the cockpit, the final system check chimed. "Flight ready," the engineer announced. Halverson turned back toward the jet. "Then get it moving." Ground crew rushed into motion. The aircraft door began closing. Jonas remained beside the ladder, still watching the girl. "You were serious," he said quietly. She nodded. "Why would someone trained at Helix be working here as a janitor?" Her gaze drifted toward the runway lights outside the hangar doors. "My parents died 3 years ago," she said softly. "No family. No money. No way to finish school." Jonas felt a heavy silence settle around the words. Behind them, the engines roared louder as the jet taxied slowly toward the runway. Halverson paused beside the aircraft stairs before boarding. He looked back once more. At the girl. At the mop. At the hangar floor. Something about the scene clearly unsettled him. "Interesting story," he said finally. Then he stepped into the aircraft. The door sealed shut. Moments later, the jet began rolling toward the runway lights. Jonas watched it disappear down the taxiway. Then he turned back toward the girl. "You didn't even ask for credit," he said. She shrugged lightly. The child needed the plane. Outside, the engine surged. The jet accelerated down the runway, lifting into the darkening sky. Jonas followed the rising aircraft with his eyes, then looked back at the quiet figure beside the hangar wall, and suddenly realized something strange. The girl hadn't once looked surprised that the repair worked. Not even a little. By the way, if you enjoy stories about hidden brilliance and underestimated heroes, make sure you subscribe, because the most powerful moments are still ahead. The roar of the departing jet faded slowly into the evening sky. For a long moment, the hangar stood quiet again. The engineers lingered near the service ladder, still absorbing what had just happened. Diagnostic tablets were lowered. Conversation softened into murmurs. and every so often someone glanced toward the girl standing beside the wall. She had already returned to work. The mop moved across the polished concrete in slow, steady strokes, as if the entire episode had been nothing more than a brief interruption in her shift. Jonas Pritchard leaned against the aircraft ladder and watched her. "You're really just going to keep cleaning?" he asked. She glanced up briefly. The floor's still dirty. Jonas let out a quiet breath of disbelief. "You reset an avionics cascade that 2 senior engineers couldn't diagnose, and you're worried about footprints." She shrugged slightly. "Someone has to be." Across the hangar, the younger technician approached, still clutching the diagnostic tablet like evidence from a miracle. "That reset shouldn't have worked that smoothly," he said. "It did," Jonas replied. The technician lowered his voice. "You really believe she trained at Helix?" Jonas looked toward the girl again. "I believe she knew exactly what she was doing." The technician frowned. "But Helix Aerospace Institute, that's where companies recruit their top engineers." Jonas nodded slowly. "Exactly." The thought lingered between them. A graduate, or even a trainee, from Helix didn't usually disappear into janitorial work, not unless something had gone very wrong. The girl finished a long sweep of the hangar floor and rinsed the mop in the bucket beside her. The metal wringer squeaked as she twisted it dry. The sound echoed faintly across the vast space. Jonas walked closer. "You knew the exact fault pattern," he said. "Yes. That loop failure, it's not something most engineers see. I studied it." "Recently?" She hesitated. "No." Jonas leaned against the maintenance cart beside her. "How long ago?" 4 years, the answer made him pause. 4 years wasn't long in aviation engineering terms. But it was long enough for knowledge to fade unless someone had practiced constantly. "You still remember the protocols perfectly," he said. She dipped the mop back into the water. "Some lessons stay with you." Jonas studied her quietly. "You didn't just study the theory, did you?" Her eyes flicked up. "What do you mean?" "That override sequence," he said. "You knew the timing down to the second." She squeezed the mop again. "The system needs 3 seconds. That's exactly what I'm saying." Jonas folded his arms. "You didn't guess that." She didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough that Jonas realized she wasn't going to elaborate. Across the hangar, the younger technician spoke again. "I looked up the Helix program once," he said. "Only a few dozen students get accepted each year." Jonas nodded. "It's brutal." The technician glanced toward the girl. "Why would someone drop out of that?" Jonas looked at her again. "Life changes," he said quietly. She had used those exact words earlier, but now the phrase felt heavier. Jonas pushed himself away from the cart. "Look, I owe you an apology." She paused. "For what?" "For not listening sooner." Her expression softened slightly. "You listened eventually, because the evidence forced me to." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Engineers aren't always good at admitting they're wrong." She gave a faint smile. "I noticed." Across the runway, airport lights flickered on one by one as evening deepened. Another aircraft roared overhead in the distance. Jonas watched the sky for a moment. "That child needed that plane," he said quietly. "Yes, and you stepped forward when everyone else hesitated." She returned to mopping the floor. "It wasn't hesitation," she said. "They just didn't know where to look." Jonas considered that. "You did, yes, because you studied systems like this, yes." The conversation might have ended there. But something in Jonas's curiosity kept pushing forward. "Helix students usually end up designing aircraft," he said. She nodded. "That was the plan. What changed it?" The mop slowed slightly. Her voice came quieter this time. "My parents," Jonas waited. "They died in a car accident during my 2nd year," she said. The hangar suddenly felt colder. "No insurance," she continued. No family left. Jonas understood immediately. Tuition, housing, survival. Dreams didn't stand a chance against those numbers. "I'm sorry," he said. She gave a small shrug. "Cleaning floors pays rent." Jonas didn't know how to respond to that. Across the hangar doors, a black SUV rolled back onto the tarmac. Jonas frowned. That was quick. The vehicle stopped beside the hangar entrance. The door opened. Victor Halverson stepped out. The CEO's expression looked very different from the one he wore earlier. Less arrogant. More unsettled. He walked slowly across the hangar toward them. Jonas straightened. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "this should be interesting." The girl kept mopping, as if the billionaire approaching them had nothing to do with her at all. Halverson stopped a few feet away. His gaze moved from Jonas to the mop bucket to the quiet figure holding it. For the first time since arriving at the terminal, Victor Halverson didn't look like the most powerful person in the room. He looked like someone trying to understand a mistake he had already made. Victor Halverson stood there for several seconds without speaking. That alone was unusual. Only an hour earlier, the CEO had filled the hangar with sharp commands and impatient sarcasm. Now he simply watched the quiet rhythm of the mop sliding across the floor. The girl didn't stop working. Water glimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights as she pushed the mop forward, then back again. Jonas folded his arms, waiting. Finally, Halverson cleared his throat. "You?" The word sounded less like an insult now and more like an uncertain introduction. She looked up. "Yes?" The CEO studied her face carefully, as if trying to reconcile two completely different people. "The janitor, the engineer who had just brought his jet back to life. You said you trained at Helix Aerospace Institute." "Yes," Halverson slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "That's a very prestigious program." She didn't respond. Jonas noticed the CEO's tone had shifted. Less arrogance, more calculation. Halverson looked around the hangar briefly before speaking again. "My aircraft landed safely," he said. Jonas nodded. "I saw the departure log." Halverson glanced toward the runway lights glowing in the distance. "The doctor sent a message mid-flight," he added. "The boy is stable." For the first time that evening, the girl allowed herself a small breath of relief. "That's good." Halverson watched her reaction carefully. "You didn't even ask if the plane made it. You said it would." The simple answer seemed to surprise him. Jonas hid a faint smile. Halverson stepped closer. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "That's always dangerous," Jonas muttered under his breath. The CEO ignored him. He kept his attention on the girl. "You diagnosed a cascading avionics loop in under a minute, yes. You identified the exact harness causing the conflict, yes. And you knew the manual reset protocol, yes." Halverson tilted his head slightly. "That's not basic training, no." The hangar hummed softly with distant airport noise. Somewhere far beyond the runway, another aircraft climbed into the dark sky. Halverson gestured toward the jet maintenance area. "You're telling me someone with that level of knowledge is currently mopping floors?" She shrugged. "It pays the rent." The CEO frowned again, as if the explanation irritated him. "That's not what I meant." "I know." Jonas leaned against the ladder. "So what exactly did you come back here for?" he asked Halverson. The CEO hesitated. That alone made Jonas curious. Halverson wasn't a man who hesitated often. Finally he answered, "I came back because something about this situation doesn't make sense." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "You mean the part where you mock the only person who could fix your aircraft?" Halverson shot him a look. "Yes, that part." The girl quietly rinsed the mop again. Water sloshed against the bucket walls. The sound echoed softly across the empty hangar. Halverson watched her work for another moment. You said your parents died, yes, and that forced you to leave Helix, yes, he nodded slowly. That's unfortunate. The girl didn't respond. Jonas noticed something interesting. For the first time that evening, Halverson sounded almost careful. The CEO looked around the hangar again, as if searching for the right words. Then he spoke. Helix trains some of the best aerospace engineers in the world. That's true. Graduates design aircraft for companies like mine. I know. Halverson crossed his arms. So here's the question I can't stop asking myself. Jonas tilted his head. What question? Halverson looked directly at the girl. If someone with your skills is cleaning hangar floors... His voice paused. What happens when you're actually allowed to work on aircraft? The girl considered that quietly. Jonas noticed the subtle shift in the room. Earlier, the CEO had towered over her with open contempt. Now the question sounded almost like an admission. He had underestimated her. The girl squeezed the mop dry again before answering. I'd probably fix more than one broken plane. Jonas chuckled softly. Halverson didn't laugh. He studied her for another long moment. You never asked for recognition tonight, no. You never asked for money, no. You didn't even ask for credit, no. The CEO's expression hardened slightly. Why? She met his gaze calmly. Because the child needed the plane more than I needed anything else. The answer landed heavily in the empty hangar. Jonas saw something shift behind Halverson's eyes. Not arrogance, not suspicion, something quieter. Respect. The CEO turned toward the runway again. Far above them, the faint blinking lights of the departing jet were still visible against the night sky. He watched them for several seconds, then looked back at the girl. I misjudged you, he said. The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. Powerful people rarely practice them. The girl simply nodded. Yes. Jonas couldn't help smiling this time. Halverson sighed. I suppose I deserved that. He reached into his coat pocket, then paused. For a brief moment, he seemed unsure how to continue, and that hesitation hinted at something none of them expected. Victor Halverson wasn't finished with this conversation. Not even close. Victor Halverson slowly removed his hand from his coat pocket, but instead of pulling out a phone or a card, he simply rested both hands on his hips. For a moment, he said nothing. The hangar lights hummed overhead, reflecting off polished concrete and the empty space where the jet had stood earlier. The girl wrung out the mop again. The quiet routine seemed almost defiant. Jonas noticed Halverson watching the movement carefully. Finally, the CEO spoke. I run an aviation company, he said. Jonas raised an eyebrow. We're aware. Halverson ignored the remark. My entire business depends on people who understand machines. The girl didn't look up. Yes, and tonight, Halverson continued slowly, the only person in this hangar who understood that aircraft was the janitor. Jonas crossed his arms. That's one way to describe it. Halverson glanced at him briefly before turning back to the girl. What I'm trying to say, he continued, is that your skills are being wasted. The mop paused, just for a moment, then continued moving. Maybe, she said. Jonas watched the exchange carefully. The CEO wasn't used to conversations where he didn't control the direction. It showed. Halverson cleared his throat. You trained at Helix? Yes. You left because you had no financial support? Yes, so let me ask you something. She finally looked up again. What? Why are you still here? Jonas frowned slightly. That seems obvious. Halverson shook his head. No, it isn't. He gestured toward the massive hangar. You work in the middle of an aviation facility, yes. You clearly still study aircraft systems, yes. And tonight you solved a failure that trained engineers couldn't diagnose, yes. Halverson leaned forward slightly. So, again, why are you cleaning floors? The girl thought about the question, then answered simply. Because nobody offered me anything else. The sentence hung in the air like a quiet challenge. Jonas looked at Halverson. Well, there it is. The CEO exhaled slowly. I suppose that's partly my fault. Jonas laughed once. Partly? Halverson ignored him. He turned back toward the girl. I told you earlier not to touch the aircraft. Yes, I said you should stick to mops. Yes. His voice lowered slightly. That was a mistake. She didn't respond. Halverson shifted his stance. Companies like mine recruit engineers from places like Helix every year. Jonas nodded. True. Most of them, Halverson continued, spend months learning the systems before they're trusted with real aircraft. The girl leaned lightly against the mop handle. And you walked up to one of the most advanced private jets in the world. He gestured toward the empty maintenance spot, and fixed it in 12 minutes. Jonas tilted his head. That does sound impressive when you say it out loud. Halverson shot him an annoyed look. Then turned back to the girl again. So here's what I'm trying to decide, he said. What? Whether you're the most overqualified janitor I've ever met. He paused. Or the best engineer I've never hired. The girl studied him quietly. Jonas watched her expression carefully. Most people would have jumped at the opening. But she didn't. Instead, she asked a different question. Why did you come back? Halverson blinked. What do you mean? The jet already left? Yes. The problem was already solved? Yes. So why are you still here? Jonas looked at the CEO curiously. It was a fair question. Halverson hesitated again. That hesitation said more than any answer could. Finally, he spoke. Because I don't like being wrong. Jonas chuckled softly. That's honest. Halverson nodded once. I misjudged you. Yes, and I'd like to correct that. The girl tilted her head slightly. How? Halverson opened his mouth to answer, but the sound of footsteps interrupted him. One of the airport operations managers hurried into the hangar carrying a tablet. Mr. Halverson, the man said quickly. The CEO turned. What is it? The aircraft sent another systems report mid-flight. Halverson frowned. Is something wrong? The manager looked uncertain. No, not exactly. Jonas stepped forward. Let me see. The man handed him the tablet. Jonas scanned the report. Then his eyebrows slowly lifted. Well, he murmured. Halverson crossed his arms. What? Jonas turned the tablet so everyone could see. The aircraft diagnostics showed perfect system performance. But one line stood out clearly. Manual override sequence detected. Halverson frowned. What does that mean? Jonas looked at the girl. It means the repair wasn't just a lucky guess. The hangar fell silent again. Because the system log confirmed something important. Someone who understood the aircraft deeply had performed that override. And the only person standing in that hangar who knew exactly how was still holding a mop. By the way, if moments like this make you realize how often brilliance gets overlooked, make sure you subscribe, because the biggest turning point in this story is still coming. Jonas held the tablet out between them, the glowing screen reflecting faintly in the hangar lights. Victor Halverson stared at the system log for several seconds. Manual override sequence detected. The words seemed to settle heavily in the quiet space. That's the reset you performed, Jonas said. Halverson looked from the tablet to the girl. You said you'd studied avionics. Yes. You didn't say you'd actually run override protocols before. She leaned the mop against the wall. I practiced them. Jonas tilted his head. In simulations? Yes. Halverson frowned. That's still unusual. Most students don't memorize manual resets that precisely. She gave a faint shrug. My instructor believed engineers should understand the system deeper than the software. Jonas nodded slowly. That sounds like Helix philosophy. Halverson crossed his arms again, though the gesture lacked the earlier arrogance. What was your instructor's name? The girl hesitated. Professor Laurent Vane. Jonas's eyes widened immediately. You studied under Vane? Halverson glanced at him. That name means something? Jonas laughed softly. Means something? Vane practically wrote the modern avionics diagnostic model. The CEO looked back at the girl again. So you trained under one of the most respected aerospace engineers alive, yes? And then ended up mopping my hangar, yes. Halverson shook his head slightly. Still trying to process that, Jonas handed the tablet back to the operations manager, who quietly stepped away. The hangar felt different now. Earlier, the space had been filled with dismissive laughter. Now it held something heavier. Recognition. Halverson walked slowly toward the maintenance ladder and rested a hand against the metal rail. You know something interesting about aviation? He said. The girl waited. Halverson continued. The entire industry runs on hierarchy. Jonas smirked. That's true. Pilots above engineers, engineers above technicians, technicians above ground crew, and somewhere far below all of them, janitors. Halverson looked directly at her. But sometimes, he said quietly, hierarchies fail. Jonas nodded toward the empty jet bay. Tonight is a good example. Halverson turned back toward him. You said earlier that Helix graduates usually end up designing aircraft. They do, so if she hadn't left school... Jonas finished the thought. She'd probably be sitting in an engineering office right now. Halverson looked back at the girl again. But instead, she's here. Yes. The CEO ran a hand across his chin, clearly thinking through something complicated. Jonas watched him carefully. He had worked around powerful executives long enough to recognize that expression. It meant a decision was forming. Halverson finally spoke again. When you diagnosed the loop, he said to her, you didn't hesitate, no, you stepped forward even after I told you not to touch the aircraft. Yes. Why? She thought about the question briefly, then answered. Because the engineers were looking in the wrong place, Jonas laughed quietly. That's painfully accurate. Halverson tilted his head. You weren't afraid of being wrong? No. Why not? Her eyes moved toward the runway lights glowing outside the hangar doors. The system behaved exactly like the failure case we studied. Jonas folded his arms. You trusted your training, yes. Halverson took a slow breath. That level of confidence usually comes from experience. She didn't respond. Jonas noticed the silence. You've done more than simulations, haven't you? The girl hesitated. Just long enough to confirm the suspicion. A few times, she admitted quietly. Jonas blinked. Where? At Helix. Halverson frowned. They let students work on real systems? Senior trainees do. Jonas shook his head, impressed. That's advanced work. The girl didn't react to the compliment. Halverson stepped away from the ladder and paced slowly across the hangar floor. Jonas watched him. You're thinking again, he said. Yes, that's still dangerous. Halverson ignored him. His gaze returned to the girl once more. You said earlier that nobody offered you anything else. Yes, he nodded. That might be about to change. The words hung in the air. The girl didn't react immediately. Jonas raised an eyebrow. Well, he muttered softly, there it is. Halverson turned fully toward her now. I built my company on two things, he said. Aircraft and people who understand them. She listened quietly. Tonight, he continued, you demonstrated something my engineers couldn't. Jonas winced slightly. Careful. Halverson smirked faintly. Relax. I'm not firing anyone. Then he looked back at the girl. I'm simply recognizing talent when I see it. The hangar lights flickered slightly as another aircraft thundered overhead. For a moment, none of them spoke. Finally, Halverson said the words he had clearly been building toward since returning. "I'd like to offer you a job," the girl blinked once. Not shocked, just thoughtful. Jonas grinned openly. About time, Halverson continued. "Not as a janitor," the girl waited, "as an engineer." The word engineer seemed to linger in the air long after Victor Halverson said it. For a moment no one moved. Jonas Pritchard leaned against the maintenance ladder with a quiet grin spreading across his face, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment since the jet engines first came back to life. The girl stood still beside the mop bucket. Her hands rested lightly on the handle, but her eyes had shifted, not surprised, just careful. Halverson noticed the hesitation. "I mean it," he said. "You'd be joining the avionics engineering division at Halverson Aerofleet." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "That's not a small offer." Halverson nodded. "It's not." The girl glanced briefly toward the empty jet bay where the aircraft had stood earlier. Then, back at the CEO, "You don't know anything about me." Halverson gave a faint shrug. "I know enough." Jonas chuckled softly. "You diagnosed a cascading avionics loop faster than my team could." Halverson continued the list. "You understood the manual override protocol. You stayed calm during a critical systems failure, and you cared more about a sick child than about proving yourself right." He crossed his arms. "Those are qualities I value." The girl considered the words carefully. The mop remained upright in her hands like an anchor. Jonas studied her expression. He could almost see the thoughts moving behind her eyes. Opportunity. Responsibility. Risk. Halverson waited. "You'd have full access to our engineering program," the CEO added. "Training resources, mentorship, a salary that actually reflected your skill." Jonas whistled quietly. "That's quite a pitch." Halverson ignored him. His attention stayed on the girl. "Well," the hangar hummed softly with distant airport noise. The girl finally spoke. "I didn't finish Helix," Jonas shrugged. "So, you'd be hiring someone without a degree." Halverson shook his head immediately. "I'd be hiring someone who fixed my aircraft." She remained quiet. Halverson tilted his head slightly. "You think degrees make engineers?" Jonas smirked. "Sometimes they just make paperwork." The girl looked down at the mop bucket. A thin ripple of water shimmered under the fluorescent lights. "Engineering isn't just fixing things," she said. "No," Halverson agreed. "It's responsibility." Jonas nodded. "She's right." Halverson spread his hands slightly. "That's exactly why I'm offering you the job." The girl looked back at him. "Because you think I can handle that responsibility?" "Yes." Her eyes searched his face carefully. "You mocked me an hour ago." Halverson didn't look away. "Yes." "You told me to stick to cleaning floors." "Yes." "You said I shouldn't touch your aircraft." "Yes." Jonas waited for the CEO's response. Halverson inhaled slowly, "And I was wrong." The honesty landed quietly but firmly. The girl studied him for another long moment. Most powerful people struggled to say those words. Victor Halverson had managed it twice tonight. Jonas pushed himself off the ladder. "You know," he said casually, "if you turn this down, I might ask him to hire me again just for the salary." Halverson smirked faintly. "You're already employed." Jonas shrugged. "Worth a try." The joke eased the tension slightly. The girl finally set the mop against the wall. The simple action felt symbolic. A small shift. But an important one. Halverson noticed. "So," he said again, "will you take the job?" She folded her arms gently. "There's one problem." Jonas blinked. "Already?" Halverson frowned slightly. "What problem?" She glanced around the hangar. At the polished floor, the maintenance ladder, the empty jet bay. "I still work here." Halverson looked confused. "That's not a problem. I'm scheduled for another shift tomorrow." Jonas laughed out loud. That's the obstacle? Halverson shook his head slowly. You're worried about a janitor shift? The girl nodded. I gave my supervisor my word. Jonas rubbed his forehead. This might be the first time in aviation history someone delayed an engineering career because of a mop. Halverson stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not the sarcastic laugh from earlier, a genuine one. Finish the shift, he said. Jonas looked surprised. Seriously? Halverson nodded. Responsibility matters. He turned back to the girl. Report to my engineering office Monday morning. She blinked. Monday? Yes, that's 3 days away, Halverson smiled faintly. Even engineers deserve a weekend. Jonas chuckled. I like this plan. The girl looked down at the mop one more time. Then back at the CEO. All right, she said quietly. I'll be there. Halverson extended his hand. She hesitated only a moment before shaking it. The handshake felt less like a business agreement, and more like the final step in correcting a mistake. Jonas watched the moment carefully. Then glanced toward the runway lights outside the hangar. Somewhere far above them, the jet the girl had repaired continued its flight through the night, carrying a child toward the surgery that might save his life. And down on the hangar floor, the janitor who made that flight possible had just become an engineer. The handshake lasted only a moment. But when their hands separated, the air in the hangar felt different. Not tense, not uncertain, just quiet and settled. Victor Halverson stepped back, adjusting the sleeve of his coat as if the moment had simply been another routine business decision. But Jonas Pritchard knew better. He had worked around powerful executives long enough to recognize when something real had happened. And tonight, something real definitely had. Well, Jonas said lightly, that might be the strangest job interview I've ever witnessed. Halverson smirked. Not exactly how we usually recruit engineers. Jonas nodded toward the mop leaning against the wall. No, most candidates don't start with janitorial equipment. The girl glanced at the mop as well, then quietly picked it up again. Halverson blinked. You're still going to finish the shift? She nodded. I said I would. Jonas laughed softly. You're serious, yes. Halverson watched her begin mopping again, the steady rhythm returning to the hangar floor. You know, the CEO said, most people would have dropped that mop the second they got a job offer. She didn't look up. Most people don't like unfinished work, Jonas grinned. That attitude might explain why she fixed your jet faster than we could. Halverson crossed his arms thoughtfully. I'm starting to see that. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, listening to the faint hum of airport traffic beyond the hangar doors. Another aircraft passed overhead, its distant roar echoing across the runway lights. Jonas leaned back against the maintenance ladder again. So Monday morning, he said. Halverson nodded. My engineering office. Jonas looked at the girl. You realize what that means, right? She kept mopping. Explain. You'll be working on aircraft systems every day, yes. You'll have access to the full avionics labs, yes. And you'll probably end up fixing mistakes made by people with far more expensive degrees. A faint smile touched her lips. That's all right. Halverson glanced toward Jonas. You're enjoying this far too much. Jonas shrugged. I like seeing talent recognized. Halverson looked back at the girl again. You're training at Helix. How far did you get? 2nd year. That's enough to understand system architecture, yes. Halverson nodded slowly. You'll still need to complete formal certification eventually. I expected that. Jonas chimed in. We can help with that. Halverson looked slightly surprised. We? Jonas gestured toward the maintenance crew area. My team trains half the new engineers anyway. The CEO chuckled. That sounds about right. The girl rinsed the mop once more and wrung it dry. The sound echoed faintly across the empty hangar. Halverson watched the motion carefully. "You really don't mind finishing this job tonight?" She shook her head. "No. Why?" The answer came simply. "Because this job helped me stay close to aircraft." Jonas tilted his head. "That's actually pretty smart." She leaned the mop against the bucket again. "Even when I wasn't allowed to work on them, I could still study them." Halverson considered that quietly. "You were waiting." "Yes." "Waiting for what?" She glanced toward the runway lights outside. For an opportunity, Jonas folded his arms. "And when the opportunity showed up, you didn't hesitate." "No." Halverson nodded slowly. "That explains a lot." The CEO stepped toward the hangar doors, looking out across the dark runway where the aircraft had departed earlier. "You know," he said, "when I first walked in tonight, I thought the most valuable thing in this hangar was my jet." Jonas smirked. "Expensive assumption." Halverson glanced back over his shoulder. "It turns out the most valuable thing was holding a mop." The girl paused briefly at that. Not embarrassed, not proud, just thoughtful. Jonas chuckled. "That might be the most honest thing you've said all evening." Halverson shrugged. "Don't get used to it." They stood there for another quiet moment. The runway lights blinked steadily in the distance. Somewhere far away, the aircraft she had repaired continued its journey, carrying a child toward surgery and a doctor toward hope. Finally, Halverson turned back toward them. "I'll see you Monday," he said. She nodded. "I'll be there." The CEO walked toward the waiting SUV outside the hangar. Before stepping inside, he paused and looked back one last time. The girl had already resumed mopping the floor. Just like before. Except now, everyone in the hangar knew exactly who she really was. Jonas watched the SUV drive away. Then he looked back at her and shook his head with a quiet smile. "You know," he said, "most engineers start their careers with a desk." She glanced up. "And?" Jonas gestured toward the hangar floor. "You started with the entire aviation industry underestimating you." She thought about that. Then simply said, "That's all right, because sometimes the best place to begin proving people wrong is exactly where they expect the least." The hangar had grown quieter by the time the night shift reached its final hour. Most of the engineers had gone home. The maintenance carts were parked neatly along the wall, and the bright runway lights outside cast long silver reflections across the polished concrete floor. The girl moved the mop slowly across the last stretch of the hangar. One final pass. One final sweep. Jonas Pritchard leaned against the maintenance ladder again, arms folded, watching her finish the job. "You know," he said casually, "this is probably the only time in history someone finished janitorial work after getting hired as an aerospace engineer." She squeezed the mop dry in the bucket. The wringer creaked softly. "I told my supervisor I'd finish the shift." Jonas chuckled. "Yeah, you did." He pushed away from the ladder and walked a few steps closer. Most people would have celebrated. She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" "You just changed your life." She looked around the hangar. At the wide space where aircraft rolled in and out. At the maintenance ladders and tool carts. At the runway lights blinking outside the doors. "My life changed the moment the jet took off," she said quietly. Jonas understood what she meant. The child. The emergency flight. The repair that made it possible. That had been the real victory. The job offer was simply the aftermath. The girl pushed the mop across the final strip of floor. Then she rinsed it one last time and set it beside the bucket. Finished. Jonas clapped his hands together once. "Well," he said, "that concludes the strangest engineering recruitment process I've ever witnessed." She smiled faintly. "I suppose so." He glanced toward the runway again. Somewhere out there that kid is probably halfway to surgery by now, yes. You saved his chance, she shook her head gently. The plane saved him, Jonas laughed softly. The plane didn't fix itself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt peaceful now, not tense like earlier, just the calm end of a long night. Jonas looked around the hangar once more. You realize something interesting? What? Earlier tonight, this place was full of people who didn't see you. She nodded. Yes. And now, he continued, every engineer in this terminal is going to remember the janitor who fixed a private jet in 12 minutes. She leaned lightly against the mop handle. That's all right. Jonas raised an eyebrow. You don't want recognition? I want the chance to work. Jonas smiled. Well, Monday morning you'll have it. The runway lights blinked steadily outside. The distant rumble of another aircraft drifted through the night air. The girl walked toward the maintenance closet and placed the mop carefully back in its place. When she returned, Jonas was still standing near the ladder. You ready? He asked. For what? For your new career. She glanced once more across the hangar floor, at the space where the jet had stood, at the ladder where the engineers had struggled, at the spot where the CEO had mocked her, and at the quiet corner where she had stood with a mop while no one expected anything from her. Then she nodded, yes. Jonas opened the hangar doors slightly, letting the cool night air drift inside. You know something? He said. What? Victor Halverson runs one of the biggest aviation companies in the country. Yes, and tonight he learned a lesson most powerful people forget. She looked at him curiously. What lesson? Jonas smiled. That the person cleaning the floor might be the one who actually understands how the whole place works. She considered that for a moment. Then gave a small nod. Sometimes power just needs the right reminder. The runway lights blinked again. Far above the airport, another aircraft crossed the sky like a moving star, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the jet she had repaired carried hope toward a hospital waiting for its arrival. Jonas stretched his arms and headed toward the exit. All right, engineer, he said. Let's get out of here. She followed him toward the hangar doors. But before stepping outside, she paused for a moment. One last look at the place where the night had begun, where someone had told her, you clean floors, not engines. She smiled softly to herself. Because 12 minutes had been all it took to prove how wrong that sentence was. If you enjoyed this story, ask me for the next story title. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. They laughed at the mechanic's daughter until her drone landed on the CEO's desk. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?